Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this session, we are going to look at the topic metaphysical poetry. So, I am describing about the term metaphysical and what is meant by this new term metaphysical poetry. When we look at this history, we should know that it's a group of 17th century poet who starts this metaphysical poetry or this genre, and they are also known as the metaphysical poets. So we can look at those poets in detail and also the major characteristics of this metaphysical poetry in this video. What does the term metaphysical means? The term metaphysical is the combination of two words, meta and physic. Meta means beyond and physic means the physical nature. Altogether, the word metaphysics deals with the questions that can be explained by science. So as the term refers, it deals with the things that beyond the physical nature. It questions the nature of reality in a philosophical way, and it is also about the exploration and philosophy, not about science and maths. So there is no place for science and it's all about philosophical things. Next, we can move to the metaphysical poetry. As I said, it's a group of poets emerged in the beginning of the 17th century whose poetry come to be known as the metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical or metaphysics in poetry is the fruit of Renaissance tree. Originally, the term metaphysical poetry was coined by John Dryden and later popularized by Samuel Johnson in his book Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. Johnson wrote about the 17th century British poets includes John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marvell and Henry Waggon in this book. This metaphysical poetry means poetry that goes beyond the physical world of the senses and explores the spiritual world. So metaphysical poetry refers to a type of very intellectual kind of poetry. It deals with abstract or philosophical subjects such as love, religion, God, beauty, faith, and so on. They were famous because of the use of witty conceits, means the metaphysical conceits, paradoxes, and far-fetched imageries. So all these were the features of metaphysical poetry, and it is also a recreation of thoughts into feelings. That the poets were creating their thoughts into meaningful and powerful feelings through their poetry. Next, we can move to the major characteristics of metaphysical poetry. First point is this: novelty in expression and thought. The metaphysical poets wholly concerned to say something that has been never said before. No matter whether this something was natural and appropriate, they endured to be singular in their thoughts and were careless of their property. They wanted to get away from the worn out and traditional ideas and forms bequeathed to the generations of poets by Petrarch. Thus, while the Elizabethan poets contented themselves with comparing a pair of lovers to a pair of doves, Donne was bold enough to compare them in a valediction forbidding mourning to a pair of compasses. The poet nurtured of the Petrarchan tradition have been wont to describe the weeping eyes as famous, but Crashaw bids farewell to this time old poetical tradition and describes the eyes of the soul. Like this, the metaphysical poets were totally different from the traditional ideas and forms of poetry, and they rejected all notions of the traditional writings. They also rejected the cult of woman worship, and instead of regarding women as goddesses worth of adoration, they represented them simply as fickle and faithless creatures of flesh and blood. Next is this: short poems. All metaphysical poems are very short and precise, and within these short lines, the writers try to convey the meaning in a complete manner. Far-fetched similes and metaphors or conceits. The metaphysical poetry abounds in far-fetched similes and metaphors, which are commonly called conceits. In it, we often come across a combination of dissimilar images or disconvey of occult resemblance in things apparently unlike. The metaphysical poets ransack the whole world of art and nature for illustrations, comparison, and allusions. T.S. Eliot has pointed out the metaphysical poetry is characterized by the elaboration of a figure of speech to the fathomless stage to which ingenuity can carry it. It also takes images from science, geography, history, etc. Next major feature is this: the metaphysical conceit. A conceit is an extended or elaborated metaphor. An extended metaphor is a metaphor that carries on through the entirety of the poem. So we can see the use of this metaphysical conceits throughout these poems. Next feature is this combination of heterogeneous thoughts. In metaphysical poetry, the most heterogeneous ideas and thoughts are yoked together by violence. For example, we can take John Donne's poem Anniversary. The poem is the celebration of a love that is a year old. It is the love trumpet resisting decay and disintegration to which earthly things offer. Suddenly, the thought of death comes to darken the joyous mood of the poet and imagines the lovers rooting away in their respective graves. Soon the poet rises to the idea of love that is eternal. Thus, in this poem, Anniversary, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked together almost by violence. So, I think this point is clear to you all that we can see the combination of these kind of heterogeneous thoughts and images of death, love, and all those things coming together within a poem in the metaphysical poetry. Next factor is that highly de-emotionalized style. So, in metaphysical poetry, emotions are shaped and expressed by logical reasoning. Like Wordsworth, they prefer words in everyday use, but their practice goes even further than his theory. Wordsworth proposed to use the natural language of impassioned feeling that we all know, but the metaphysical poets use the natural language of men when are soberly engaged in commerce or in scientific speculation. They do not use easy or emotionally exciting rhythms unlike the Elizabethan poets, but the rhythms they use are as intricate as their thoughts and their function is to stimulate intellect. As I already said in the introduction, these metaphysical poets used their own style in the writing and they didn't follow the traditional way of writing style which was used by the Elizabethan poets or the poets in the previous centuries. Conceits are the term for figures of speech which establish a striking parallel between two dissimilar things or situations. While conceits used by Elizabethan poets were merely ornamental in nature, conceits in a metaphysical poem are often an instinct part of the poet's technique of communication, amplification, and persuasion. We can also see the witty, ironical, and conversational tone in all these poems. The metaphysical poems are realistic and rational in their approach. They are marked by subtle wit, irony, and are composed in the style of everyday conversations. Major themes of metaphysical poetry. Major themes are spirituality. They all are focused on spirituality. When we consider the case of the writers, means metaphysical writers, for example, John Donne, Crashaw, and all these all writers were spiritual poets. They were focused on spirituality. Second one, they focus on love, especially Platonic kind of love. Platonic means it's not the sexual kind of love, it's the eternal love or spiritual love. So they all believe in such kind of a love. Next point is originality. All metaphysical poets are unique. They all have some kind of unique features which make them different from the other writers. Then they stood against their contemporaries. As I said, they didn't follow the conventional mode or conventional way of writing which was introduced by their contemporaries. They developed their own style and they started to write in this style. Thus, that style as metaphysical poetry was formed and introduced to the world of literature. Next point is use of wit. Metaphysical poems are realistic and rational in their approach. They are marked by subtle wit, irony, and are composed in the style of everyday conversations. So, as I said, we can see a lot of witty expressions in the metaphysical poems. Next point is obscurity or difficulty. The charge of difficulty is commonly leveled against the metaphysical and not without justification. The metaphysical poetry is as difficult to understand as Browning's, which is a grand puzzle to the readers. The obscurity of the metaphysical poets proceeds from their attempt to say too much and not from that to say too little. The rapidity with which one thought succeeds another is dazzling and confusing, with the result that the readers fail to grasp its full meaning. These poets uses figures of speech which are unknown to all, but they specialized in geography, science, medicine, in all these branches of knowledge. They see things from a myriad points view, but give only a hint of each separate vision, and the readers go on groping in order to know the exact character of the vision. It means that it is not easy to understand the metaphysical poetry in the first reading itself, and we need more concentration to know and get the full essence of the poetry. So these are some of the major features of this metaphysical poetry, and let's move on to the metaphysical poets. John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, Abraham Cowley, Richard Churchill, Henry Vaughan are some of the famous metaphysical poets. We can start from John Donne. John Donne is the leader and founder of the metaphysical school of poetry. His poetry is a revolt against the popular current. John Donne's poetry is metaphysical because of his individualism and his quest for learning. His poetry is full of wit. It is obscure and it indulges in far-fetched conceits. It fuses thought and emotions. It is also logical, analytical, and mystical. John Donne is well noted for his religious verses and treatises. The second poet is George Herbert. George Herbert is known as the metaphysical poet and by virtue of his faith in God and religion. He gave up life of worldly pleasures and worldly ambition in order to become a country priest and to devote himself to the service of God, both in capacity as a poet and as a priest in practical life. Herbert's poetry is a sequence of religious poems conceived and cast in the pattern of a morality play. The chief subjects of his poetry are the incarnation, the passion, and the redemption. He talks of man's relations to God, of body to the soul, and of life here to the hereafter. His poems, most of which are argumentative, depict a conflict between the worldly and the unworldly pleasures. By the end of each, he asserts his faith in the divine life of a Christian. His works were notable for purity and effective use of words. The third writer is Richard Crashaw. Richard Crashaw is one of the metaphysical poets remarkable for the brilliance and extravagance of his language and imagery. His poems are longer and more elaborate than that of George Herbert, although his themes are narrower in focus. Crashaw is sometimes ranked with Donne and Herbert as a major metaphysical poet. Alternatively, he is linked with such significant but minor writers as Abraham Cowley and Henry Vaughan. His works were treated as dissenting metaphysical poetry, as an outstanding example of ornate wit, as conventional Catholic devotion, and as intensely personal expression. Next author is Andrew Marvell. The abrupt and striking beginning is a common aspect of metaphysical poetry that we can find in Marvell's poetry. He uses the familiar and simple conversational style of language very effectively. He is noted for intellectual, allusive poetry that is rich in metaphor and conceits. His works incorporates many other elements associated with the metaphysical school, like the tension of opposing values, metaphorical complexities, logical and linguistic subtleties, and unexpected twist of thought and argument. He also wrote a varied array of poems that blend grace with the age's characteristics, metaphysical wit, and complexity. When we reached at Henry Vaughan, we can see that his poetry does not contain the sharp metaphysical qualities as we find in John Donne's or in Andrew Marvell's poetry. The tone of his poetry is in an essential sense reflective and philosophical. The blend of emotion and thought is one of the important marks of metaphysical poetry, and in Vaughan there is a fine blend of deep religious emotion with its The blend of emotion and thought is one of the important marks of metaphysical poetry, and in Vaughan there is a fine blend of deep religious emotion with intellectual thinking. He has infused his poems with love of nature. Besides, there is a strong note of mysticism in his poetry. It has been rightly said of him that he prays not in a church but in the open air. In spite of having other elements, Vaughan's poetry is evidently rich in terms of metaphysical elements. That's all about the metaphysical poetry and poets.